Hey, greetings everyone. It's Naomi Wolf of Outspoken and Daily Clout. And as promised, I'm here with picking up with the 1560 Geneva Bible, the Founders Bible, the Puritans Bible, Jefferson's Bible. You can see that I have my wood pile behind me. I thought we'd lose power, but we haven't. And I have my dog who just had a bath on my lap, just out of the frame. Loki finds baths quite emotionally overwhelming. So he's depleted uh, and collapsed on my lap, where he likes to be during my podcasts. I've also heard the many emails from people who would like me to keep my hair out of my face. So this is a second recent podcast in which I've taken that on board. And having said that, I also just want to take a moment, not getting political, but I don't see this as political. Horrible things are happening as I speak in Minnesota. There's an uprising against law enforcement. And I'm sure many of you have different points of view about this. And I grieve for any loss of life, of course. However, I just want to take a moment to thank our law enforcement and our police and our firefighters and the first responders, our soldiers and sailors. You know, I've really been thinking about this as the wife of a veteran. You know, my husband has, I think it's okay that I'm saying this, but, you know, he's been blown up multiple times. He has, scars on his body from injuries. He's raced into danger more times than he can probably ever. Well, he's not allowed to describe everything to me, but, you know, I don't even know the numbers of times his life has been on the line. And I'm just thinking about the rule of law tonight. And it's very appropriate because the Torah is the law. We're reading the law. It wasn't considered a sacred book when it was written. It was referred to as the law. Even Yeshua, centuries later, refers to the Torah as the law. So, and this is God's law, and God is really clear that it's his law. And so just think about the rule of law. And I had this argument with a loved one earlier tonight who's very, liberal. I think of myself as very liberal, but we're different kinds of liberal right now. And she's very, very, very upset about the second fatality of a protester in Minneapolis at the hands of ICE. And I basically tried to say to her, Mom, I think it's okay that she usually lets me use her as an example of, a thoughtful liberal that I'm having debates with. But I asked her to think about the rule of law. ICE, whether you like the laws that they're enforcing or not, right now, the laws they're enforcing are United States federal law about immigration. They are. And if you don't like the laws, we live in a democracy in which you can elect other members of Congress in the midterms or elect another president, when this term is over, or even repeal, run a campaign to repeal those laws and change those laws as we do with BillCam and change the laws. But right now, that's the law of the land. And the people who are here, whom ICE is targeting, arresting, detaining, are here against United States law. And so I get the appeal as a former lefty of, suiting up and going out to the most exciting thing to have happened to the left, since the Black Lives Matter protests, which is these dramatic protests that could turn violent, that are becoming increasingly violent against ICE arrests. But I really want you all, and I want my loved one with whom I had this argument, to really think about the rule of law. Governor Tim Walz insanely compared what's going on in Minneapolis to and St. Paul to Anne Frank's travails and death at the hands of the actual Nazis. And, that's such a horrific, shocking, awful, wrong, ahistorical thing. because ICE is not the Gestapo, and the people who are dying, very sadly, while choosing to be at an extremely dangerous federal law enforcement operation where everyone is armed, and the activity of the protesters is guaranteed to escalate the violence, right? Like impeding vehicles and shrieking in people's faces and so on, which is just very difficult for human beings to sustain. Or even going armed. And God bless him, may he rest in peace. But the most recent citizen who passed away was armed, with a weapon that had a magazine loaded into it. I'm not saying no one deserves to die, but that, and driving into law enforcement or driving away from law enforcement, impeding law enforcement, not complying with what law enforcement is asking you to do, is very, very, very dangerous. And I would never do it. I'm a civil libertarian absolutist. When I protested outside, most recently when I was arrested um, during the protests of Occupy Wall Street, I was protesting outside an event that had Governor Cuomo inside. And the minute the police officers, and this is on video, you can see it, told me I was under arrest, I complied. I put my hands behind my back as they handcuffed me, and I complied, and I went where they told me to go, and I did what they told me to do, because resisting arrest is also a crime. So it's very dangerous what these protesters are doing. And again, I believe in protest. I believe in peaceful protest. I believe in the First Amendment. But leaving that aside, right? The assumption, the Washington Post wrote a hectoring op-ed today, sort of scolding the ICE officers and the policy that ICE was pursuing that led to this fatality. And I just, again, as the wife of a soldier, I just want people to think about what these men and women face every day. What our soldiers face, what our firefighters face. Why do we, I've really been thinking about this. Why do we treat their bodies so disposably? Why do we treat their trauma, their fear, as being so much less important than that of, the victims? I'm stopping myself from putting that in quotation marks, because obviously people who are, dead due to these conflicts are victims, of course. But somehow the culture empathizes with the grief and the terror of, the people caught up in this violence, and their families, but there's never any coverage of the grief and terror of ICE officers facing this kind of assault and frightening environment in which to do their jobs, and never any coverage of the grief and terror of their loved ones who are waiting at home, not knowing if dad's going to come home or mom's going to come home tonight. And the same is true, I don't know why, for soldiers and cops and firefighters, as if, well, firefighters are kind of lauded, but soldiers and cops, they're like disposable. They're treated disposably. Their bodies are disposable. Why is that? I've really been thinking about it. I think it's a class thing. Like, they mostly come from the working middle classes, and the elites just can't, love them somehow. They're not in the category of people you're supposed to love. Like immigrants, you have to love. Illegal immigrants, you have to love. People of color, you have to love. People with, non-mainstream sexualities, you have to love. But no one says, oh, include those, often young men and women from the working middle classes in your love, in your compassion. And the other thing I want to say is, everyone's got opinions about what that ICE officer should have done, what those ICE officers should have done. Why don't they, shoot them in the legs? Why don't they, they should have known that the gun was holstered, and so on. And I'm now speaking as someone who has spent time as a journalist in conflict areas. You cannot Imagine in the United States of America, if you are not a soldier or a journalist who has gone to war, what war feels like. You cannot project the kind of reasoning that you can do sitting with your Washington Post, in front of your fire at home, deciding that, that ICE officer should have known that that person was no threat, the gun was holstered and so on. Literally, people who have never been to war or never been in combat zones, as I have and as Brian has, obviously he much more than I, or much more actively than I just went as an observer, you have no idea how terrifying it is. You have no idea how terrifying it is. And also, your mind doesn't work the same way in combat that it does in peace. Adrenaline takes over, the amygdala, which is the flight or fight response, takes over. You're not, sitting there with your prefrontal cortex active going, maybe I should, da, 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 da. No, you do not know if you're going to die, if, that weapon is going to mow down a dozen innocent bystanders. And you're trained to shoot to kill. Brian explained this to me, and it's something to think about. Law enforcement are not trained to shoot at people's legs, or soldiers aren't. There may be jurisdictions where this is not the case, but what Brian explained to me is you're trained to go for what is called the kill zone, which is, head or chest, because you're in a war. And if there's a threat coming at you, right, which you have a split second to assess, the chances of making a mistake are so escalated by the conditions that Governor Walz and irresponsible, evil people. There is a worldwide rush for gold right now and precious metals. China is buying gold. There are rumors that the Federal Reserve will be using gold to pay off federal debt, or the federal government will be using gold to pay off federal debt. Famous investors are buying gold. And there's a movement away from the dollar worldwide. And you can see that there are warning signs in the economy that appeared before the Great Depression in 2008 that are flashing red right now. So in all this instability, it is a very good idea to protect your savings, to protect your IRA by diversifying into precious metals, especially gold. There are a lot of gold companies out there. Not all of them are kosher. Not all of them are responsible businesses. American Alternative Assets really is. And we're very, very proud to have them as a sponsor. We're very picky about our sponsors, and we only accept sponsors who have products that we either use or invest in ourselves. So I really encourage you to go to cloutgold.com, cloutgold.com, and get a free report explaining to you what the risks are of not diversifying into gold and silver. And I just want to know that when Brian and I started talking about investing in gold 5 years ago, when it first became clear that you could do that easily, if we'd put in $1,000 then, it would be 5,000 now. If we'd put in 10,000 then, it would be 50,000 now, and so on. So obviously you can't predict everything about the future, but gold there's a limited amount of it on the planet. And in a time when you can have your assets switched off, if they're digital, like the truckers in Canada had their bank account switched off. People in Spain are having their bank account switched off. All of China is now on a social credit system. Your assets can be switched off. And Europe is pushing for central bank digital currency. Now is the time to diversify into gold, including our most senior leaders on the left are encouraging, put your bodies on the line. I'm seeing that phrase from liberal leaders, like members of Congress, put your bodies on the line. It's very dangerous language, this militant language, because it creates an environment that is like war. I mean, it is turning technically into an insurrection, but from the point of view of the ICE officers, they're in a war zone, and the people are going to get hurt and die in a war zone. And I'm just so tired of, armchair quarterbacks saying, oh, they should have known. They should have known not to shoot him. They should have known that, Renee Good was not going to run over the ICE agent. They cannot know. In a war zone, you cannot know. All right. Like, I wore a bulletproof vest and traveled embedded with the Israeli military when I was 19 years old in southern Lebanon, when it was a war zone, an actual war zone. Thank God I wasn't armed, but the people around me were armed. And if something had come at us, that suddenly, that we couldn't immediately assess as not a threat, in a war zone, you have to assume, your brain assumes it could be a threat and that it could kill you. And there's no way that your prefrontal cortex is going to, sit there and analyze the situation the way all these people judging, these poor ICE agents, just to, like, I have sympathy for the dead civilians, of course, but I would never, ever, ever, ever put myself in that situation in an active law enforcement environment where these people are arresting. They're going in. No one cares about what the ICE agents are facing. They're going in to enforce the law, but also to arrest cartel members and pedophiles and human traffickers and drug traffickers, violent people, murderers, and criminals. They don't know every time they enter a room if that's their last moment. That's who they're going in after. So, and yes, sometimes they make a mistake and sometimes they arrest an American citizen. Then they let them go because our system is working. That's how our system is supposed to work. There's no guarantee that you won't be mistakenly arrested, but that's how our system works. If you're mistakenly arrested, you get due process and you get released. And I'm sure there are, shortcomings in our judicial system and in our criminal justice system, of course, but we have a system that works and it's actually working. And, it wasn't President Trump who brought 30 million people breaking the law into the United States of America, many of them criminals and committing crimes, but even just being here illegally is committing a crime. The national security threat, which pretty much no one talks about, or very rarely, of 30 million people who haven't been vetted the way that a legal immigrant is vetted, right? Many of whom have ties to terrorist organizations, as J.J. Carroll, a former ICE agent, has confirmed. It is a huge national security threat. So President Trump and ICE are dealing with this mess, and real leadership would say in Minneapolis, St. Paul, everyone calm down. Don't impede federal law enforcement. We'll take them to court. That's how our situation is supposed to work. You can engage in lawful First Amendment protected freedom of assembly, of course, but that doesn't include interfering with law enforcement activities. It's so dangerous. It's dangerous if you're armed. It's dangerous if you're using your vehicle as an obstacle. It's dangerous if you're driving your vehicle, toward law enforcement. It's dangerous. And we have to think about, this is the last thing I'm going to say, think about the rule of law. If we didn't have people who were willing, what I said to my loved one was, why should anyone serve in ICE or in a police force or as a soldier if they're going to be in a situation in which they're dealing with people who are armed and their weapons are loaded and anything could happen? It's a recipe for disaster and chaos. And, imagine it in any other population, that you're in a prison or you're in an occupying force in the military, and the people you're trying to keep order among are all, are all carrying weapons that are loaded. It's terrifying, and there are going to be mistakes. Okay, it is Second Amendment protected. I'm not saying it isn't, but there are going to be mistakes, and even just the screaming, and the driving the cars to block people. That why should anyone expect that there will always be ICE agents? 20% of the cops have quit in New York because cops are being treated so horribly already by the Mamdani administration. Why should we assume there will always be cops? Soldiers wait for 6 months to get basic care at the VA, veterans, because all the money is going to caring for illegal aliens. And there isn't a budget to look after our veterans. Why should we assume there will always be veterans, right? Like, or there will always be soldiers, that there will always be firefighters, people willing to run into a building to save you. And when you're in trouble, those are the people you always call. You always call those people. You count on them to save you, but you also want to make their lives impossible when they try to enforce the law and create a dangerous, threatening situation in which they're working. You can't have it both ways. And if there is no rule of law, if we get to a point where ICE just quits and the cops just quit or don't even bother going into dangerous situations, which is what happens in failed states, they still have law enforcement. They just stand by when something terrible is happening that the cartel is doing or that the gangs are doing. It's women and children and the elderly and the disabled who suffer most when the rule of law fails and you can't count on law enforcement anymore. It's chaos, and the most vulnerable suffer the most. So think about that. Do you really want to F with ICE to the point that they quit and the cops quit and the firefighters quit? Think about what the rule of law really means. These people are enforcing the law. If you don't like that law, change the leadership, right? But you don't get to terrorize law enforcement in the United States of America, who are doing their jobs in enforcing the law. That's my preamble to tonight's reading. You may agree with me or not agree, but I felt like it was important to say it. And I think it's relevant because you're listening to this Geneva Bible reading because you care. What is God's law? What did God say the law was? And you just, like, Americans are so spoiled and they think the law will be there forever. And I've traveled, my friends, in many countries where the rule of law has collapsed. And I cannot tell you the level of fear people live with every day and the level of violence and insecurity that they live with every day and that their children live with. And again, it's women who are raped, it's children who are assaulted or kidnapped, it's the elderly who are terrorized or kept in their homes forever because it's too unsafe to go outside. You don't want that. So I'm speaking to my, former tribe on the left. Rethink this seriously, because you can't assume those people, ICE and cops and firefighters and soldiers and sailors, will be there forever to look after your sorry self if you continue to torment them and not appreciate them and not make sure that their bodies are safe as well. That's it. That's what I had to say as a preamble. All right, let's go to the Geneva Bible, and I am sharing my screen. I figured out how to do it. I was having technical troubles, as you recall, before. So here we go. You can see that, chapter 19. And the subheadline, which again is not in the text, says, "The sacrifice of the red cow, the sprinkling water, he that touches the dead, the man that dies in a tent." And the Lord, and now the text begins, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law," which I was just talking about, "which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring you a red cow without blemish, wherein is no spot, in which there is no spot, upon which never came yoke." There's never been a yoke on this cow. And the note says, "According to this law and ceremony, you shall sacrifice the red cow. And you shall give her unto Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her without the host outside the community, and cause her to be slain before his face." If you hear snoring, that's Loki, it's not me. "Then shall Eleazar the priest take of her blood with his finger and sprinkle it before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times, and cause the cow to be burnt in his sight with her skin and her flesh and her blood and her dung shall he burn her. Then shall the priest take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet lace and cast them in the midst of the fire where the cow burns. Then shall the priest wash his clothes, and he shall wash his flesh in water, and then come into the host, the community, the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until the evening. Also he that burns her shall wash his clothes in water and wash his flesh in water and be unclean until evening. And a man that is clean shall take up the ashes of the cow and put them without the host, outside the community, in a clean place. And it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for a sprinkling water. It is a sin offering. Therefore, he that gathers the ashes of the cow shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. And it shall be unto the children of Israel and unto the stranger that dwells among them a statute, a law forever. He that touches the dead body of any man shall be unclean even 7 days. He shall purify himself therewith the 3rd day, and the 7th day he shall be clean. But if he purify not himself the 3rd day, then the 7th day he shall not be clean. Whosoever touches the corpse of any man that is dead and purges not himself, meaning, purges, you understand what it means, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the sprinkling water was not sprinkle upon him. He shall be unclean, and his uncleanness shall remain still upon him. This is the law. When a man dies in a tent, all that come into the tent and all that is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And all the vessels that shall be open, which have no covering fastened upon them, shall be unclean. Also, whosoever touches one that is slain with a sword in the field, or a dead person, or a bone of a dead man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Therefore, for an unclean person, they shall take of the burnt ashes of the sin offering, and pure water shall be put thereto in a vessel. And a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle it upon the tent, and upon all the vessels, and on the persons that were therein, and upon him that touched the bone, or the slain, or the dead, or the grave. And the clean person shall sprinkle upon the unclean the 3rd day and the 7th day, and he shall purify himself the 7th day, and wash his clothes, and wash himself in water, and shall be clean at even. And the note says, because he had been among them that were unclean, or else had touched the water, as verse 21. And the clean person shall sprinkle upon the unclean the 3rd day and the 7th day, and he shall purify himself the 7th day, and wash his clothes, and wash himself in water, and shall be clean at evening. But the man that is unclean and purifies not himself, that person shall be cut off from among the congregation, because he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, and the sprinkling water has not been sprinkled upon him. Therefore shall he be unclean. And it shall be a perpetual law unto thee, that he that sprinkles the sprinkling water shall wash his clothes. Also he that touches the sprinkling water shall be unclean until evening. And whatsoever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person that touches him shall be unclean until the evening. So that is the Geneva Bible. Now let's take a look at Numbers Sfaria. Now something interesting is happening. I'm going to look on a new tab. Chabad got taken down, or, oh, great, it's up. All right, Numbers 19. They were having some sort of technical trouble, and I was hoping it was not an attack. Let's see what's going on. Yeah, it's back up. Good. So we're going to look at Chabad's Numbers 19, and we're going to stop the screen there, and we're going to go ahead and look at Numbers 19. But before I get into Numbers 19 on Chabad, you guys, let's just reflect on what's going on here. I mean, what it causes me to think about is God is really setting a boundary, and we can assume it's one that didn't really exist previously, or else it wouldn't be so detailed, right? Between the clean and the unclean, or the language we've used before, the sacred and the profane, not profanity like sexual profanity, but say the opposite of sacred is profane, like not sacred, right? Um, in relation to life and death. And I I really want to think about this, because it's very, very, very moving. God is on the side of life, in this chapter. I mean, always, but although he is responsible for both life and death, it's clear that he wants the children of Israel to value life, to live in life, to not take life for granted, to prolong life, um, to not take life improperly, and he doesn't want us to be friends with death, or to help death. There's a wonderful and a St. Vincent Millay poem that says something like, I'm not going to, death may come, I can't stop it, but I'm not going to help it. I'm not going to give it a hand. I won't give him a hand up on his horse. He'll get no assistance from me. And that's what I hear God asking us to do here. And it really makes you think about things like abortion and euthanasia. God is not just saying, don't kill your elderly parent who can no longer work and is kind of a drag to look after, or is incontinent or whatever. He's saying not only don't kill them, but you're unclean if you even touch a dead body, if you even touch the bone of a dead human being, that's been out in the field, and the body's no longer there. It's decomposed, whatever. Don't even touch the bone. You're unclean. Don't, if you go into a tent where someone passed away, every single thing that is open, every vessel that isn't covered is unclean. And earlier in, I think, Exodus, we had a lot of details about how you purify vessels that are unclean. Now, there could be a medical reason for this, right? I mean, if someone died in a tent, they could have died of, cholera or tuberculosis or, leprosy. And so very rudimentary understanding of germ theory or viral transmission or, contamination would indeed wisely lead God to tell people, if there's open water and someone who has an infectious disease died, the water might be contaminated. And in fact, this is contaminated water is how typhus and cholera were spread. It took a long time to figure it out. But he's also saying death is really, really, really the opposite of where I want you to live. What I want you to celebrate. I want you to celebrate life. And it sounds like I'm saying something really obvious that doesn't need to be said, but it kind of does need to be said, because we used to take for granted that life was much better than death. But I think the kind of satanic elements in our culture are trying to get us to forget that, and to get us used to. I mean, look at goth, look at goth fashion. There's so much celebration of death, skulls and skeletons, and so much celebration of death in pop music, pop culture. And then you get actual kind of not celebration, but banalization of death with, like, the MAID program in Canada, where they're just, giving medically assisted suicide or medically assisted suicide to younger and younger people, healthier and healthier people. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, it's so they can traffic the organs. Obviously, that's so foreseeable. But my point is, God is asking us never to go down that road, to not go near anyone who would deal death, not go near death, right? You're unclean. Like, obviously, someone has to bury the body, but they're unclean for 7 days and they have to ritually purify themselves. And God has said this before. There have been prohibitions against, what you're supposed to do, or prohibitions against coming back into the community before you've cleansed yourself and purified yourself if you've touched a dead body. It definitely makes me think about abortion, like, it's like I'm still pro-choice in the first trimester because I can't find a way not to be, but definitely this whole trafficking in late-term fetuses and, laws that say you can neglect a baby to death for up to a month. These are really happening, right? And this is the other side of what God wants us to do. It's very clear, so we let ourselves forget this, how seriously God takes death and causing death, and how much he wants us to live and be in life, right? But we should really hear that an abortion, a dead fetus, is an abomination to God. And you shouldn't traffic it, you shouldn't sell its organs, you shouldn't take it lightly, right? It really makes me think. I mean, there's so many grieving women, and again, I have to say I'm pro-choice in the first trimester because I can't find a way not to be. Long conversation, right? I believe strongly in contraception and, avoiding abortion at all costs, avoiding unplanned pregnancies at all costs. Much longer conversation, but I really am thinking about this need to cleanse oneself, that comes straight from God's mouth, right? And I think maybe the trivialization of abortion and the fact that women who've undergone that procedure, or that, you know, appalling experience, depending on what you want to call it, um, don't have any way to cleanse themselves spiritually, right? To acknowledge what they've gone through to heal. I wrote an essay about this a long time ago in the 90s called Our Bodies, Our Souls. Anyway, euthanasia. I mean, it's so clear from this passage. You're never supposed to do it. You're not supposed to wrap your arms around death. You're not supposed to usher death in the door. You're not supposed to help death. Death is in the hands of God, 100% in God's law. And I would like there to be loopholes around that as a pro-choice woman, but there really aren't. I mean, I have to acknowledge there's a contradiction there. Anyway, don't embrace death. Don't be self-destructive. The God is saying that the whole panoply of things, don't kill yourself with drugs. Don't kill yourself with alcohol. Don't kill yourself with inertia, physical disregarding your body, right? All of those things go along with don't help death. Don't give death any assistance. Death is impure. It makes you impure. You've got to go outside the congregation if you engage with death and purify yourself. So those are just my thoughts. That's my reflection on this passage. Now let's go to Chabad. And I will share my screen, which I'm so happy to know how to do. Bamidbar. Remember, in Hebrew, we are not in Numbers at all, but in the desert. Okay, chapter 19. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. And you know what that means by now. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, Zot chukat haTorah. This, and it's feminine because chukah is feminine. Zot chukat haTorah. This is the law of the Torah. Remember, we started this podcast talking about laws. Asher tziva Adonai, which God commanded. Sava is the same root as mitzvah. It's a commandment. Okay, yes, Loki, I love you. Asher tziva Adonai, which God commanded. Lemor, saying, Daber el bnei Israel. You know what that means. Speak to the children of Israel. Veikru elecha para, and take toward you a cow. Aduma, red. Tmima, pure. unblemished, asher ein ba mum, which no yoke has laid on her, asher lo ala aleha ol. Wow, listen to that poetry. Ein ba mum, there's in her no blemish. Asher lo ala aleha al. Can you hear that beautiful, beautiful poetry? I'm going to read it again. Asher lo ala aleha ol. Upon her no yoke has been laid. But you hear, like, it's a miraculous language. It's a miraculous text, the Torah. I could not have ever put together a phrase of so much poetry, the repetition of the L sound, the ah sound, to say this direct thing, upon which no yoke was laid, asher lo ala aleha ol. Amazing. Vinatata natatem, and you all will give, ota el Elazar, her to Elazar, hakohen, the Cohen, vehotziota el michutz lamachane, and you'll take her to outside the camp, veshachatota lefanav, and you'll slaughter, and the name of a slaughter is a shochet, you'll slaughter her in front of him. V'lakach Elazar HaKohen, and Elazar the Kohen will take midama, from her blood. Dam is blood. Be'etzba'o, on his finger. Ve'hiza el nochach pnei ohel moed, and he'll sprinkle it toward the front of the tent of meeting. Midama, from her blood. Sheva pe'amim, 7 times. V'saraf et hapara, and will burn the cow. Le'enav, literally to his eyes. They translated in his presence. Et orav, et bisarav, et dama, her skin and her meat and her blood. Al prosha yisrof, on with its dung, literally on its dung, you'll burn it. V'lakach HaKohen etz erez, and the Kohen will take a piece of cedar wood. Ve'ezov ushni tolaat, ve'hishlich el toch srefat hapara, hyssop and crimson wool, and cast them into the burning of the cow. Ve'chibes bigadav hakohen, and the Kohen will wash his garments. Ve'rachatz besaro, and he'll bathe his flesh. Now, the word basar means flesh, it means meat. It's the same word you heard a paragraph before talking about the meat of the cow that is slaughtered. So it's a commonality you're hearing between humans and animals. Rachatz besaro, he'll rinse his flesh, his meat, literally. B'mayim ve'achar yavo el hamachane, in water, and after he'll come toward the camp. Ve'tameh hakohen ad ha'erev, and the Kohen shall be tameh, you know that word, unclean, to evening. Veha soref ota yichabes bigadav, and the one who burns it will wash his clothing, literally launder his clothing, b'mayim, in water. V'chachatz besaro b'mayim, and he'll wash his meat, his flesh, in water. V'tameh ad ha'arev, and he's unclean until evening. And I'm going to skip a few more paragraphs about the cow's ashes and go to the treatment of bodies of human beings. Hanogea bemet, he who touches, the toucher, literally. Bemet, in a dead person. Lechol nefesh, ve'tameh shiv'at yamim. Bemet lechol nefesh, the corpse of a human soul. And he is unclean for 7 days. And then on the 3rd and 7th day, he cleanses himself. And let's go to line 13. Kol hanogea bemet, everyone who touches, bemet benefesh ha'adam, in the soul of a human, asher yamut, which dies, velo yitchata, and he does not cleanse himself, et mishkan Adonai, he has defiled the Mishkan, the presence, the seating place of the Lord. Time v'nichreta, and that soul shall be cut off from Israel. Hanefesh hahu, that spirit, Misrael, from Israel. And you hear the repetition of spirit, spirit, soul, nefesh, nefesh, Misrael, ki me nida, because the sprinkling water, lo zorak alav, was not thrown on him. Tameyeh, he'll be unclean, impure, od tum'atobo, and his uncleanliness remains upon him. Line 14, Zot HaTorah, this is the law. And you hear that word Torah, which means the law. Zot HaTorah, Adam ki yamut ba'ohel, a man who dies in a tent, Kol haba el ha'ohel, everyone who comes to the tent, V'chol asher ba'ohel yitma, and everything in the tent is unclean, Shivat Yamim, 7 days. And I'm going to skip ahead to line 16. V'chol asher yiga, and everyone who will touch al pnei hasadeh, on the face of the field, a beautiful phrase, bechalal cherev, one slain by the sword, o bemet, or a corpse, that word mavet, met, means death, o be'etzem, or a bone, adam, of a human being, o be'kaver, or grave, yitma shivat yamim, he'll be unclean for 7 days. And it talks about how to ritually clean yourself. And then line 20, very serious, ve'isha shel yitma, and a person who, and remember this is reflexive, right? Impures himself is literally what yitma means, defiles himself. Ve'isha shel yitma velo yitchata, and does not cleanse himself, v'nichrata hanefesh, that soul will be cut off, hahu, that one, mitoch hakahal, from all the congregation, ki et mikdash Adonai timeh, because the sanctuary of the Lord he has defiled. Me nida lo zorak alav, the sprinkling waters were not thrown on him. Tamehu, he is unclean. And then line 21, V'hayita lahem, and it will be to them lechukat olam, a law for the world, which means forever. Chukat olam, and this is a different word than Torah, which also means law. Chok means law. Lechukat olam u mazeh me hanida, and one who sprinkles the sprinkling waters, v'chabes gadav, and shall wash his clothes, v'hanogea b'mei hanida, and he who touches the sprinkling waters, yitma ad ha'arev, will be unclean till evening. And it ends, v'chol asher yigabo, and everyone who touches him, hatameh, will be unclean, hatameh yitma. You hear that poetry, the uncleanness, he will be uncleaned upon them. V'hanefesh ha-nogaat, and the person, or literally the soul, who touches titma ad ha'arev, will be unclean until evening. So there you have the Hebrew, and I hope you hear the poetry. As always, I hope you hear the poetry. If you wonder what's going on, Loki has positioned himself behind my back against the chair and is scratching quite a bit. I'll have to make sure he doesn't have anything causing his itching, but that is the activity behind me, in case you're wondering. So this is really extraordinary. I think it's even clearer in the Hebrew that how unclean the uncleanness is, right? Of touching the bone or the grave or the dead body. It really makes you think, and there are very severe penalties for not cleansing yourself. In one of those lines, the very scary conclusion that his uncleanness stays with him is concluded, and that's very serious because it means he's cut off from the congregation. He can't be part of the community. So this is a life and death thing, to cleanse yourself from the uncleanness of embracing death or getting too close to death or being careless about death, is how I read this. Death is not supposed to be brought into the gates of life. is how I read this. I could be overreading. It could just be a germ thing. It could just be random ritual. But I think it matters because I think we can construe from this that it was still a time when, well, we know it, when babies were sacrificed to Baal, their bodies were just thrown to the fires. And, I don't know what burial practices were in the tribes that were around the children of Israel. Obviously, the Egyptians have very complex burial practices, but God doesn't want those, right? God doesn't want people to be mummified. God doesn't want people to be their bodies, their dead bodies, to be fetishized the way they were in Egypt. That's really interesting, right? And in fact, in Judaism, and we're going to get more of this, but to this day, we don't buy fancy caskets. At least observant Jews don't, or people who take these directives seriously. We don't burn the corpse. You're not supposed to cremate the body because you're supposed to give the body back to God on Judgment Day when the bodies rise up. That's literally the belief. You're not even supposed to, I kind of violated the law because my ears are pierced, but you're not supposed to pierce your ears. You're not supposed to get tattoos because you're supposed to give your body back. We've talked about this earlier, I think, to God in the condition that you received it. And we have very simple burial practices, a plain pine box, nothing fancy. We certainly don't have open caskets. We've talked about that. We don't turn the body into an object of, I don't want to be disrespectful in saying we don't fetishize the body, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say. No disrespect to other people's practices. But I think you can also assume that, this was still a world in which dead soldiers were left on the battlefield and their fellow soldiers weren't allowed to come collect them to give them a decent burial, right? In fact, that is the subject of some Greek drama, notably Antigone, later. But it was a world in which life and death were not separated as clearly as God is separating them here. And even into the Roman period, as I've mentioned before, the Romans still exposed babies that they didn't want to death. They just left them out on the hillside till they died. That still happened. This is many centuries later. So God is creating a boundary. This is a very profound passage, actually. I didn't fully appreciate how profound. We take these things for granted, that life and death are separate and that you're not supposed to embrace death, but that had to be taught to us, and we could lose it, I think, is the message of this chapter. And we will lose it if we're not careful. We are losing it, those of us who are not careful, who let death in. Now we're going to go to the RSV, which I don't like that much. I'm going to share my screen. I'm so proud of myself for figuring out this screen sharing. Let's share the screen and look at the RSV and see if there's anything that comes up that we can see as a difference in the translation. A heifer without defect. Well, that's really interesting. In popular culture, this character, the red heifer, which comes into being now, there may have been a mention of a red heifer earlier in Exodus. I don't recall. Take a look. But this is a detailed description of the red heifer without defect. That the third temple is supposed to be heralded by the sacrifice of a red heifer, a perfect, without blemish red heifer. But it's not a heifer. In the Hebrew, it's a cow, which I think is interesting. I don't know why they mistranslated it as heifer. There's nothing. A heifer is a calf, kind of a teenage calf, as I understand. But it's a cow. It's just a cow, and it's a cow in the 1560 Geneva Bible too. That's interesting. Slaughtered before him, and the heifer shall be burned in his sight. Her flesh, her blood, her dung shall be burned, and scarlet stuff, and cast them into the midst of the burning of the heifer. Then he'll wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he'll be unclean till evening. He who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes in water and bathe his body in water, and shall be unclean till evening. Well, it doesn't say body. Remember, it says flesh or meat. I think that's interesting. And a man who's clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place. And they shall be kept for the congregation of the people of Israel for the water, for impurity, for the removal of sin. So this is very interesting. It's not sin. Sin is a different word. It's chet, is sin. This is not, I don't think this is sin. Let's take a look at line 9 in the Hebrew. What is it? A ritually clean person, this is Chabad, shall gather the cow's ashes and place them outside the camp in a clean place, and it shall be a keepsake for the congregation of the children of Israel for sprinkling water used for cleansing. So that is a completely different sentence than the Revised Standard Version, which is, and a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place, and they shall be kept for the congregation of the people of Israel for the water, for impurity, for the removal of sin. It doesn't say that in the Hebrew. It says for cleanliness, for cleaning. And it doesn't mention sin at all. That's weird. And then let's see line 10. And he who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. And this shall be to the people of Israel and the stranger who sojourns among them a perpetual statute. Let's see line 10, because I don't remember that the same way. Okay, this is interesting. The one who gathers the cow's ashes shall wash his clothes, and he shall be unclean until evening. It shall be an everlasting statute for the children of Israel and for the proselyte who resides in their midst. And you came upon this word before. It's the same word, hagar. It's also translated as stranger or alien, and they translate it as stranger who sojourns among them. So I would say in this case, the Revised Standard Version is more accurate than the Chabad, which does say proselyte, but it's not proselyte in the Hebrew, which I've brought up before. And then the rules about uncleanness till evening. Whoever in the open field touches one who is slain with a sword or a dead body or the bone of a man or a grave shall be unclean 7 days. That's all accurate. And the clean person shall sprinkle upon the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. That's fine. And then the last line is, but the man who is unclean and does not cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, since he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, because the water for impurity has not been thrown upon him. He is unclean. And it shall be a perpetual statute for them. He who sprinkles the water for impurity shall wash his clothes, and he who touches the water for impurity shall be unclean until evening. And whatever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and anyone who touches it shall be unclean until evening. So let me see if 21 is water for impurity in the Hebrew. I think it's a little different. Let's see. This shall be for them as a perpetual statute, is the Hebrew. And the one who sprinkles the sprinkling waters shall wash his clothes. And the one who touches the sprinkling waters shall be unclean until evening. Isn't that interesting? In the Hebrew, me hanida. In the Hebrew, it isn't about, the water isn't for impurity. It's called, in this line, it's called the sprinkling waters, me hanida. Let me just look up nida in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's interesting. Nida, I thought so, refers to a menstruating woman, the state of menstrual impurity, or the laws governing marital separation and purification during menstruation. And that's what Nida has come to mean. But in Strong's Hebrew, which is a wonderful source, 19th century concordance, the word Nida is, Mehanida. It's come to have a lot of meanings around menstruation, but it's separation originally, or I think we can say that that is the most narrow meaning. From nadad, properly, rejection, by implication, impurity, uh, and removed, put apart, set apart, nida. All right, mehanida. So I don't know why Chabad translates it as sprinkling waters, mehanida. But I think the most accurate translation would be, waters of separation, or waters of the distinction of purity and impurity. Um, but having said that, the Revised Standard Version just says the waters for impurity, and I I don't think that I think that adds a layer of um, interpretation that isn't there. It's really waters that separate purity from impurity. So that's it. We are out of time. We've come to the end of our hour together. Um, think about that. I hope you think about that. It's really interesting. I had a dream last night, a lot of very disturbing dreams. We're kind of snowed in, and it's been an arduous few days with the weather. And I had a dream that I've been trying to keep kind of kosher, kosher-ish. I'm trying. I'm doing my best. And I do find that it does make me feel closer to God. It does, because I don't think it's in the ham sandwich that my separation from God inheres. But as we've seen over and over and over, God really wants us to want to do what he wants, right? Even if it doesn't make sense to us. And I always think of a marriage, like, I know you love to pile things in corners and under beds, and it really bothers me. So, honey, do it for me, even if you don't see it the same way. Like anyone who's been married or has a relationship of any kind, can think of those things that don't really make sense to the other person, but you feel so seen and cared for when they're like, okay, I don't get why you're so phobic about piling things in corners, but I'll do it for you because I hear you, I see you, I love you. This story so far, that is the number one theme. God just wants us to, be in a relationship with him that's mutual, where we get we get to ask for what we want, and he gets to ask for what he wants too, because it's a real authentic love relationship. So that is totally not, as I say over and over, not how I was taught to think about God and the relationship with God. But I think it's beautiful and meaningful. So I had this dream that I was eating a really delicious ham sandwich with mayonnaise, which is my favorite, and mustard on a lovely crusty French roll, kind of a hoagie roll, actually. It was a big ham sandwich. And it occurred to me that I was eating a ham sandwich and it wasn't kosher. And then I kind of thought in the dream, well, it doesn't really matter, and it's so delicious. There are no snacks for miles. I was on a journey of some kind, and I really better just eat this ham sandwich because it's going to be inconvenient otherwise. It was a rationalization. And then the whole rest of the dream was about various kinds of, like, feeling like I was in a dimension or a space that was impure, or that it had a sense of guilt, and not being in alignment with God. I've had dreams that were like heaven type places, and dimensions of total moral purity. They were fantastic. This was not that. This was like, ugh, everything was a little bit awry, and people doing things they really shouldn't do, and people paying the price, spiritually, and being held accountable. It was like really awful, things kind of dirty and short of the mark, right? And maybe I had that set of dreams, so I would share them with you today. Maybe it's just my random subconscious, but purity matters. Who knew? And so I guess it matters to God. And I don't think, I've said this a million times, I don't think it means being self chastising or self, you know, critical in a hate filled way at yourself. But I do think in that excuse me, still small voice, God does let us know, what he wants from us. I don't think we can pretend to be in ignorance, because if you do listen, he does make it clear, and it's different for all of us. Sometimes, some things are probably the same, like don't kill people, who are, don't murder people, don't neglect your father and mother, don't, abandon your children, like don't cheat people, all those things. But purity, I guess I would leave this podcast by saying, think about what purity is for you. Think about what impurity is for you. I mean, so many of us struggle with addictions, right? Whether it's alcohol, drugs, pornography is a huge one that so many people I know, so many relationships, or not that I know so much personally, but that, wrote to me after my book about human sexuality. Oh my God, such an issue. Or, whether it's just habits like gossip, or, being controlling, or like, what is impurity for you? What is purity for you? What do you think God wants from you in terms of purity? I think that if we all kind of reflect on that a little bit, we probably know the answer. We probably do. I mean, let me just give you an example. I tend to be very flighty about admin. And I kind of have a very not good script in my head that's like, well, you're busy with so many things, you can't be bothered with this boring admin. And that's a very bad thing, because people count on me to come through with boring admin. So for me, my impurity in my life, I'm sure I could find lots of them, but one of them is that I rationalize not taking care of things that I should do for people that are boring. So I owe a vendor a check. It's a small check, but it's a paper check, and it needs to go in an envelope with a stamp. And that's a chore. It's a small chore, but it's something I've been putting off just because I don't have stamps, but I like, that's my impurity. I don't get to keep this guy waiting, for his payment for the work that he did for me, even though it hasn't been long and it's a little bit of money. I don't get to rationalize that, right? That would be impure. And God made it clear, like, don't do that. Treat people honorably the first time around. Another example of impurity is I don't always listen to what people I'm working with want to do before I tell them what I think should happen. That's, a form of impurity, I would say. That's not the highest integrity. I could go on and on. I mean, I'm going to be having, 2 glasses of red wine and pretzels, even though I know I probably shouldn't have 2 glasses of red wine and pretzels while I watch, binge watch Victoria on Netflix. Maybe 1 glass of wine and, nuts is not, dipping in the impurity, like heading into, impurity, lack of balance, lack of kind of perfect self-respect. Because not that good for me to have 2 glasses of red wine and pretzels every night, when I'm snowed in. Not every night, but when I'm snowed in. Anyway, that's a lot of information from me about myself, probably too much. You can come up with your own. But the thing is, what I really want to say is, we know ourselves, right? And we know what our impurities are, what our temptations to be impure are. And I didn't like how I felt about myself when I ate that delicious ham sandwich. So that's where I'll end. I like the more I know about, what God said he wants, the more I like being aligned with him. Even though short term, it's like, ugh, what does Sabbath mean? Whatever, I've got to rationalize checking Pinterest, right? I like how it feels to do what he says he wants, at least in this text. Not everything, because I'm not there yet, but a lot more than I used to. All right, you guys, I'd love to know in the comments what your thought. There's so many comments. Well, if you guys don't mind, I'm gonna go over a little bit and see if there are any comments that I really need to share. Oh, so many comments. Netaslabi writes in from Japan, and you need to rethink your betrayal of the democracy. I guess that's in relation to what I was saying. Lots of trolling from my first comments about ICE. Didn't you write the end of America? Or criticism. I don't mean to suggest everyone who criticizes me is a troll. Didn't you write the end of America about the evils of authoritarian government? What the fuck happened to you? Yes, I did. And that is why I'm so consistent in saying we have to observe the rule of law. Part of living in a democracy is not engaging in insurrection. I mean, I'm sorry, like I have lots of friends who thought January 6th was okay. I didn't think it was okay. It's not okay. There may have been a lot of provocateurs and, plants and weirdnesses. I certainly think it was facilitated by, Democrats, but people shouldn't create mayhem in the people's house where the business of the people is done, and the mobs shouldn't storm our civic institutions. And I was very, very, very consistent about that. This is an insurrection, and you have responsibilities as citizens as well as having responsibilities as law enforcement and as leaders, and you have to obey the rule of law if you're a citizen. And the people that ICE is arresting are not obeying the rule of law, and they're not citizens. The end of America is about democracy. You need citizens to have a democracy, right? You can't have a democracy if, 1 person in 5 is not a citizen. It just doesn't work. You can't have an informed electorate. And you need borders to have a democracy. And you also need citizens who go about changing the situation lawfully. And, if they don't like what ICE is doing, they can pass laws to change it. They can change the leadership. But what ICE is doing right now is enforcing the law. And if they overstepped, there will be an investigation. And, if they did something wrong, there are penalties for that, and sometimes criminal penalties. So, we don't know yet. There hasn't been an investigation yet. But I think that tyranny can come from both sides. It can come from the grassroots or from provocateurs in the grassroots in this very militant situation I see in Minneapolis. And it can come from ICE or from, the president or from Kristi Noem. We have to check tyranny always. But that's my answer to you. I am the same person who wrote The End of America. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Lots of people are disappointed in what I had to say about ICE. I'm sorry about that. Ruby, Mariella, Alicia, Martinez, if you want to say more, I can address it. Let's see. Lots of people just tuned in. And you realize when Trump loses. Okay. Hello, Naomi. You do realize when Trump loses in midterms, Fauci will never stand trial. The COVID scam will never be mentioned again. We do what we can. And I certainly want Fauci to stand trial, but Trump's in power now. President Trump's in power now, and he's not standing trial. Let's see. Lots of back and forth. Lucy Liu says Jesus ended the sacrificial system forever. It will never be restored. Well, for Christians, that's true. And, we've talked about that in the past, how Yeshua is seen as the Paschal lamb, the sacrificial lamb, to take the place of all this animal sacrifice, which was part of the worship of God in the desert, and then will also be the case when the first temple is built and when the second temple is built. But also, we no longer sacrifice. We Jews no longer engage in animal sacrifice. because the temple was destroyed and we were scattered in 70 AD all over the world. We don't have a temple. So rabbinic Judaism arose as a result, and we, worship God in synagogue. We read the Torah, but we no longer do all these things. We don't kill lambs. We don't scatter blood. We don't do any of it. As I've said before, the only kind of vestige or memorial we still have is on Passover, when there's a bone of a lamb on the Passover Seder plate to remind us of sacrifices, and specifically the events of the 10 plagues that preceded our leaving Egypt. But that theme of sacrifice goes right on through. Oh, interesting. I don't really think that happens. Went to a cemetery in Kobe, Japan, when a Jewish man was buried, no coffin. His body was wrapped and thrown in the hole. I really did not like that. Nita, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I've never heard of that. So I would just want to verify that. Let's see. Lots of people have opinions about bacon and crab. Oh, this is nice. Barry Atkinson. Hi, Barry, good friend. For many years, says God loves obedience. It demonstrates that we love him. Yes, but I would say, and I had this conversation with Brian actually recently. Brian was talking about faith, and I said, honey, it's so cool that in Hebrew, the word that is often translated as faith is more like trust. And actually, every morning, this is very beautiful. I've talked about this. Every morning when you wake up, you are supposed to say, as an observant Jew, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechzarta bi nishmati bechemla gdola emunatecha, which means, blessed are you, Lord our God, creator of the universe, who has returned my soul in me, in great mercy, your emunah, your trust is your belief is very strong. In that kind of emunah is the word that is often translated as faith, but it's more like trust or belief. And I love that. Because blind faith is something I just can't have in God. Like, oh, he says so, so you just have to not question it. That's not the same as not wanting to do what God asks. But I didn't like, when I was a kid, being told, well, blind faith means you just, take as given what the intermediary says, the representative of God, and you can't ask questions. I never liked that. And it's a very un-Jewish way to approach all of this. As I've said before, we're all about asking questions, and God lets us argue with him even. But at the end of the line, as Barry Atkinson rightly says, God loves obedience. It demonstrates that we love him. Totally. I would just slightly shade the word. I've been trying to avoid words like obedience, because it seems like a master-slave relationship. When, like, if your husband or wife does what you ask them to do, you don't think of it as, oh, my husband's obeying me, my wife is obeying me. Like, that would be a very dysfunctional relationship. You just appreciate that they're in harmony with your wishes and acknowledging your wishes, responding to your wishes. We don't really have a good word for it, which is a shame, because it's a beautiful thing. But, doing what your loved one wants, that's a phrase that means what Barry Atkinson is describing. And I think that's right. I think God loves it when we do what he asks us to do, because it shows we love him, as you so rightly say. Are you familiar with Karaite Judaism? That is a very interesting question. I have learned about it a little tiny bit when I was reading the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, because the scholar who translated the Gospel of Matthew is a Karaite Jew, and he explained to me what that is. And he makes the case that Jesus was a Karaite Jew. And what that means is a Jew who goes back, correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you, Netta. You're exactly right. That's the person whose name I forgot. Nehemiah Gordon is the expert that I interviewed about the Gospel of Matthew. He is a Karaite Jew. And what that means is a Jew who goes back to before rabbinical Judaism. So goes right to the Torah, kind of bypassing rabbinical Judaism, which came later, of course, after the exile. So I have a lot of sympathy with that, because things get, in every religion, things can detour, and they can filter through human interpretation. And when there's authorities, things filter more and more. And you see that in Catholicism, you see it in Protestantism, you see it in Islam, certainly. You see it in rabbinical Judaism, in my view. I think there's a lot of value, obviously, in rabbinical Judaism. Obviously, I'm getting so much out of Chabad, which is rabbinical Judaism, right? The Rebbe who started Chabad is a rabbi, and he's interpreting the Torah and the commentaries in a specific way. And rabbis are deeply enmeshed in the commentary that is after, the Torah. Oh, I'm glad I got that right, Ricardo Yamuri. I'm glad I didn't embarrass myself there. But I love that idea of like, I've been a Jew my whole life and going to synagogue, and I was never really very moved by the prayer books or the prayers that rabbinical Judaism, as a conservative, meaning more free form than Orthodox, right? Doesn't mean less free form. Or even going to Reform Temple, even more. It just didn't do it for me. But reading the Torah does do it for me. It's so much more exciting to hear what God actually apparently said, or may well have said to real people, than to get like filters and filters, especially as you get into modern religion, whether it's Judaism, Protestantism, Catholicism, but I'll stick to Judaism, filters of committees basically write, the prayer books, or revise the prayer books and translate the prayers and so on. And it's been shocking to me, just like it's been shocking seeing how many mistranslations are in modern versions of the Bible compared with the Hebrew, and the pretty faithful 1560 Geneva Bible. It's shocking to me when I look at the Hebrew and then look at like a 1950s to 21st century Reform or conservative prayer book, and they just put things in there that are not in the Hebrew, or they soften things, or they get rid of. I mean, the same process you see with the RSV. They get rid of difficult points. I mean, an example is, many of the prayers in Hebrew are to Avot, the forefathers. And then, of course, conservative and Reform Judaism added Avot ve'Imaot, the forefathers and the foremothers. And then, the forefathers, you list them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the conservative and Reform translations would list, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, Rebecca. I think I have that right. And it's just not there in the Hebrew. And I don't see anything wrong. Like, you can practice an egalitarian service, an inclusive service, without doing violence to the original historical text. I mean, I personally think that the original primary text is sacred. You can have a footnote, saying, many people want to remember the foremothers. You can remember them if you want. They were Sarah, Leah, Rachel, Rebecca. I think that's correct. So thank you for bringing that up, Ricardo Yamuri. I love going back to the original, and the fact that we have listeners around the world, incredibly enough, for this Geneva Bible series of readings, shows that a lot of you like to go back to the original. See, what did God say? Like, what did God actually say? And by the way, this is even more important, because the more I learn, no disrespect to modern Christianity, just like I'm critical of a lot of modern Judaism, departing from the Torah or throwing things in that just really aren't there, smoothing the edges. So more and more people are telling me that their church doesn't read the Bible, that or that there's very little Bible reading, and there's very little Old Testament reading, and that a lot of what they're getting is interpretive, or spectacle, or sermons that don't go back to the text. So that's very sad and also very dangerous, because it means people can be told things about the Bible that are not true. And God knows this is happening with, the revision of, we've talked about this, like, anti-Semitic revision of who Jews are in relation to Christians, but and vice versa. But it's very dangerous because the Bible itself is such a source of wisdom and comfort and orientation toward what God wants. And if people are, being asked to go to church, but they're not being given the Bible to read anymore, certainly not given an accurate translation, as we see again and again with the Revised Standard Version, that's very heartbreaking. It means people's hearts are not being filled as they could and should be with this incredible text and knowledge. And then Netta says, oh, well, I won't go down that rabbit hole, Netta, because it's something I don't know anything about, but thank you. I think we should stop there. We've gone over, but we have more than 1,000 people listening on just this one platform, which is so nice, and many thousands on other platforms. And, I'm just going to say again that the Geneva Bible readings are number 7 in Judaism in the Congo, Republic of Congo, week after week. Sometimes they're in the top, 1 or 200 in Australia. Sometimes they're in the top 1 or 200 in Canada. I'm so moved that there are readers, Pakistan, like readers around the world, listeners around the world. So I do want to ask you, if this is meaningful to you, please go to 1560 Geneva Bible, read by Dr. Naomi Wolf on Substack. It's kind of an ungainly title, but it's there. Subscribe, follow, and if you go to Spotify or Apple, you can also find it. Follow and subscribe on Apple. It's free, of course, but the more you engage, the better for us, and the easier it is for us to make this work. So I'm going to sign off now. Think until I talk to you again, think about what you're doing that could give you that wonderful feeling of purity. What are you doing that makes you feel kind of icky because it makes you feel kind of impure? And not in a punitive way, but just in a kind of gentle way. Approach that in your mind and your heart. If you want to, all of this is up to you, and see what you come up with. We'll talk about that when I next see you, I hope. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.